The first snowflake hit my windshield at exactly 4:30 in the morning, and I knew by the time I finished my coffee, Breckenridge, Colorado would be buried under 2 feet of fresh powder. I owned a snow removal business, and winter storms were when I made my living. My diesel plow truck sat in my driveway, engine block heater plugged in like it had been every night since November. But even with that precaution, the big Cummins engine needed a solid 15 minutes of idling before I could safely put it under load without risking catastrophic damage. I pulled on my boots and winter coat, grabbed my travel mug, and headed outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The cold bit at my exposed skin as I climbed into the cab and turned the key. The engine coughed once, then roared to life with that distinctive diesel clatter. I left it running and headed back inside to grab my work gloves and check the weather radar one more time. That was when I saw her. Patricia Drummond, president of the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association, standing on her front porch 3 houses down, illuminated by her porch light, staring directly at my idling truck. Even from this distance, I could see her writing something on a clipboard. My stomach sank. I had lived in this neighborhood for 3 years, and Patricia had been a thorn in my side for every single one of them. She was the textbook definition of an HOA tyrant, a 52-year-old woman with too much time and too much authority over other people's lives. She had cited me for leaving my trash cans out 20 minutes past the designated time, for planting flowers that were supposedly not on the approved color list, and for parking my work truck in my own driveway during what she claimed were restricted hours. I ignored her and went back inside, giving the truck the full 15 minutes it needed before heading out to start my route. I had 12 commercial properties and 8 residential driveways under contract, and the snow was falling faster now. By the time I pulled out of my driveway, visibility had dropped to less than a quarter mile. The day was brutal. The storm that meteorologists had predicted would be moderate turned into one of the worst January blizzards Colorado had seen in years. I worked straight through until 8 that evening, plowing, salting, and clearing snow in an endless cycle. My phone rang constantly with emergency calls from property managers and panicked homeowners. By the time I finally headed home, I had been behind the wheel for nearly 16 hours straight. I pulled into my driveway at 8:45, every muscle in my body aching. The truck's engine was still hot from the day's work, but I knew by morning it would be frozen again. I plugged in the block heater, hauled myself inside, and collapsed onto my couch without even bothering to heat up dinner. The knock on my door came at 7:30 the next morning, just as I was preparing to head out for another day of snow removal. I opened it to find Patricia standing there, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a puffy white coat that made her look like a snowman. Behind her stood another HOA board member, Susan Kelly, holding a tablet and looking uncomfortable. "Xavier Rayburn, we need to have a word with you," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I have to get to work, Patricia. Can this wait?" "No, it cannot. You violated HOA Covenant Section 12.7 yesterday morning at 4:35. Your vehicle was observed idling in your driveway for an extended period, producing excessive noise and emissions." I stared at her in disbelief. "You're kidding me." "I assure you I am not. The covenant is very clear. No vehicle shall idle in any driveway or street within the community for more than 3 minutes. You were observed idling for approximately 15 minutes. It's a diesel plow truck. It needs to warm up before I can use it, or I'll destroy the engine. It's -5 degrees outside." "That is not my concern. The rules apply to everyone equally. You are being fined $500 for the first offense. $500 For warming up my work truck, Susan shifted uncomfortably behind Patricia but said nothing. Patricia thrust an envelope into my hand. This is your official notice. You have 30 days to pay. And Mr. Rayburn, be advised that if this violation continues, subsequent fines will be $1,000 each. She turned and walked away before I could respond, Susan hurrying after her like a nervous shadow. I stood there in my doorway, the cold air pouring into my house, holding the envelope and trying to process what had just happened. Inside the envelope was a formal letter printed on HOA letterhead, citing the exact covenant section, the date and time of the alleged violation, and the fine amount. At the bottom was a note stating that I could appeal the fine by requesting a hearing before the HOA board within 14 days. I called my lawyer that afternoon during a break between plowing jobs. Marcus Hendricks had helped me when I first bought the house and had to review the HOA covenants. He listened to my explanation and sighed heavily. Xavier, I'm going to be honest with you. HOA covenants are legally binding contracts. If the covenant says no idling beyond 3 minutes, they technically have the right to enforce it, even if following that rule would damage my equipment. Unfortunately, yes. However, you do have the right to appeal. I'd recommend requesting a hearing. Bring documentation about why the warm-up period is necessary. Get something in writing from a mechanic or the truck manufacturer. This is insane. Welcome to HOA living. Do you want me to draft the appeal letter? Yeah, please. And Marcus, I'm not paying this fine. This is my livelihood we're talking about. He paused. I understand, but I need to warn you. If you refuse to pay and lose the appeal, they can place a lien on your property. They can even move to foreclose eventually. For a $500 fine, it wouldn't be just $500 by then. There would be late fees, legal fees, collection costs. I've seen it balloon to tens of thousands. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache building. Just draft the appeal letter. I'll get the documentation from my mechanic. Over the next week, I gathered my evidence. My mechanic, Tom Davidson, had been maintaining diesel equipment for 30 years. His shop, Davidson's Diesel Service, was located just outside Breckenridge proper and had a solid reputation. I explained the situation to him, and his weathered face darkened with anger. These HOA people don't have the first clue about diesel engines, he said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. You start putting load on a cold diesel, especially in sub-zero temperatures, you're looking at accelerated wear on bearings, pistons, cylinder walls. The oil hasn't had time to circulate properly. The fuel hasn't atomized right. The whole system is stressed. 15 minutes is the minimum warm-up time I recommend for trucks like yours in these conditions. Can you put that in writing? Officially? Absolutely. I'll write you a detailed letter explaining the mechanical necessities. And if they want me to testify at this hearing of theirs, I'll do that too. This is ridiculous. True to his word, Tom produced a comprehensive 2-page letter on his business letterhead, explaining in technical detail why the warm-up period was essential. He cited manufacturer specifications, industry standards, and his own 3 decades of experience. He even included photographs showing engine damage from cold start operations. Marcus submitted my appeal request along with Tom's letter. 2 days later, I received a response scheduling a hearing for February 15th at 7 o'clock in the evening at the community clubhouse. The letter stated I would have 15 minutes to present my case, and the board would render a decision within 7 business days. February 15th arrived with typical Colorado winter weather, clear skies but temperatures hovering around 0. I dressed in my best jeans and a button-down shirt, nothing too fancy but respectful enough for the occasion. Tom met me at the clubhouse parking lot, carrying a folder with additional documentation he had prepared. "You nervous?" he asked as we walked toward the entrance. "More angry than nervous. I still can't believe this is happening." The clubhouse was a modest single-story building with a main hall used for community events. Inside, the HOA board sat at a long table at the front of the room. Patricia was in the center, with Susan to her left and 3 other board members I recognized but didn't know well spread out to her right. About 15 other residents sat in folding chairs arranged in rows facing the board. Patricia banged a gavel, and the room fell silent. "This hearing is called to order. We are here to address the appeal filed by Xavier Rayburn regarding citation number 2047. Mr. Rayburn, you have 15 minutes to present your case." I stood up, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on me. "Thank you. As you all know, I own a snow removal business. My work truck is essential to my livelihood. The citation I received was for idling my truck for 15 minutes before leaving for work on January 7th. I'm here tonight to explain why that warm-up period is not optional but mechanically necessary." I gestured to Tom, who stood up beside me. "This is Tom Davidson. He's been a diesel mechanic for 30 years and maintains my truck. He's prepared a detailed explanation of why the warm-up period is essential." Tom stepped forward and launched into his explanation. He spoke clearly and confidently, breaking down the technical aspects in terms the average person could understand. He explained how diesel engines work differently from gasoline engines, how the fuel system requires proper temperature to function efficiently, how the oil needs time to circulate through cold metal components, and how premature loading causes accelerated where that could lead to catastrophic failure. The manufacturer of Mr. Rayburn's truck specifically recommends a minimum 15-minute warm-up period when temperatures drop below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, Tom said, holding up a printed page from the owner's manual. "This isn't Xavier being lazy or inconsiderate. This is following the manufacturer's guidelines to protect a $60,000 piece of equipment that he depends on to feed his family." One of the board members, a man named Richard who I had spoken to a few times at community events, raised his hand. "How much would it cost to repair the damage from not warming up the engine properly?" "Depends on the extent of the damage," Tom replied. "Minor damage, you might be looking at $5,000 to $10,000 in repairs. Major damage, you're talking about a complete engine rebuild or replacement. That's $20,000 to $30,000 easily." Susan looked visibly uncomfortable, but Patricia's expression remained stony. When Tom finished and sat down, Patricia shuffled some papers and cleared her throat. "Mr. Rayburn, while we appreciate the technical information, the HOA covenants are very clear. The noise and emission restrictions exist for the benefit of all residents. We cannot make individual exceptions based on personal circumstances or occupational requirements. If we did that for you, we would have to do it for everyone, and the covenants would become meaningless. But this isn't about personal convenience," I argued. "This is about protecting essential work equipment from damage. The alternative would force me to either destroy my engine or move, which seems unreasonable. The covenants were established and voted on by the community. You signed acknowledgement of these covenants when you purchased your property. Ignorance or inconvenience is not grounds for exemption." A woman from the audience raised her hand. I recognized her as Jennifer Martinez, who lived 2 streets over. "I have a question. How many other residents have been cited for idling violations?" Patricia frowned. "I don't see how that's relevant to this hearing." "I think it's very relevant. It seems like selective enforcement if Xavier is being targeted but others aren't." "Mrs. Martinez, This hearing is specifically about Mr. Rayburn's violation. Other matters are not under discussion. But Jennifer had struck a chord. Several other residents began murmuring and nodding. A man near the back stood up. I warm up my car every morning before I drive to work. Are you going to fine me too? If your vehicle idles for more than 3 minutes, then yes, you are in violation, Patricia said sharply. The room erupted into overlapping conversations. Patricia banged her gavel repeatedly until order was restored. We will take Mr. Rayburn's appeal under advisement and render our decision within 7 business days as stated. This hearing is adjourned. I left feeling frustrated but slightly hopeful that the community pushback might influence the board's decision. Tom clapped me on the shoulder as we walked to our vehicles. You did good in there. Hopefully they see reason. The decision letter arrived 6 days later. The appeal was denied. The letter stated that while the board acknowledged the mechanical necessities I had presented, the covenants must be enforced uniformly, and no exception could be granted. The $500 fine stood, and I was warned that any future violations would result in escalating penalties. I called Marcus immediately. They denied it. Now what? Now you have a few options. You can pay the fine and try to work with the board on amending the covenants, which requires a vote from the community. You can refuse to pay and let them pursue legal action, which I don't recommend. Or you can sue the HOA, arguing that the covenant is unreasonable as applied to your specific situation. What are my chances if I sue? Honestly, maybe 50-50. Courts generally uphold HOA covenants, but there's precedent for ruling them unenforceable when they're unreasonable or selectively enforced. The fact that they're specifically targeting you, while presumably others idle their vehicles every day, could work in your favor. How much would a lawsuit cost? Realistically, you're looking at $10,000 to $20,000 in legal fees, depending on how far it goes. I did the math in my head. Even if I won, I would be spending far more than the fine amount. But this wasn't just about $500 anymore. It was about Patricia's power trip and the principle of the thing. What if I just refuse to pay and see what they do? Then they'll add late fees, send it to collections, and eventually place a lien on your house. It'll mess up your credit and could impact your business. Xavier, I know you're angry, but sometimes you have to pick your battles. I hung up feeling defeated. The next morning, I paid the fine online, watching $500 disappear from my account, but I didn't stop warming up my truck. I couldn't. The temperatures remained below freezing for most of February, and every morning my truck needed that full 15-minute warm-up period. 2 weeks after I paid the first fine, I received another citation. $500 again. Then 3 days later, another one. Patricia was apparently watching my house like a hawk, documenting every single morning I warmed up my truck. By the end of February, I had accumulated 4 citations totaling $2,000. I had paid the first one but refused to pay the others. Marcus was fielding increasingly aggressive letters from the HOA's attorney threatening legal action. That was when things took an unexpected turn. Jennifer Martinez, the woman who had spoken up at my hearing, contacted me through Facebook. She asked if I would be willing to attend an informal meeting at her house with some other concerned residents. I agreed immediately. On a Saturday afternoon in early March, I found myself sitting in Jennifer's living room with 8 other homeowners. Jennifer explained that several of them had received citations for various minor violations in recent months, and there was growing concern that Patricia was abusing her authority. She fined me $300 for putting out decorative garden flags that weren't on the approved list, said an older gentleman named Walter. I had to go to the county records office to even find this approved list, and it turns out it was made 15 years ago and never updated. I got cited for painting my front door, added a young woman named Casey. The citation said the color wasn't approved, but my door is literally the same color as 4 other houses on my street. As everyone shared their stories, a pattern emerged. Patricia had become increasingly aggressive with enforcement over the past 18 months, targeting residents seemingly at random with obscure covenant violations and hefty fines. The other board members either supported her or were too intimidated to push back. "We need to recall her," Jennifer said firmly. "According to the HOA bylaws, we can petition for a special election to remove board members. We need signatures from 20% of homeowners to trigger the vote." "How many houses are in the community?" I asked. 243. "So we need at least 49 signatures." Walter nodded slowly. "I think we can get that. A lot of people are fed up but didn't think they could do anything about it." We divided up the community into sections and agreed to spend the next 2 weeks collecting signatures. Jennifer created a simple petition document explaining the recall effort and listing examples of unreasonable enforcement. We printed dozens of copies and started knocking on doors. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Nearly everyone I spoke to had either been cited for something questionable or knew someone who had. Many people were afraid to speak up individually, but were relieved to learn that others shared their concerns. Within 10 days, we had 73 signatures, well over the required threshold. Jennifer submitted the petition to the HOA board on March 18th. According to the bylaws, they were required to schedule a special election within 45 days. The recall would require a simple majority of voting homeowners to pass. Patricia did not take this well. 3 days after the petition was submitted, I received a certified letter from the HOA attorney. It stated that my unpaid fines now totaled $1,500 with late fees, and if payment was not received within 10 days, the HOA would file a lien against my property. I forwarded the letter to Marcus. He called me within an hour. "Xavier, we need to talk about strategy. This is getting serious." We met at his office that afternoon. Marcus spread several documents across his desk, his expression grave. "Here's where we stand. The HOA is within their legal rights to file the lien. Once that happens, they can potentially move to foreclose if the debt remains unpaid, though that would take months or years. However, the timing here is suspicious. The fact that they're escalating immediately after you signed a recall petition could be construed as retaliation. So what do I do? File a lawsuit. Not over the covenant itself, but claiming selective enforcement and retaliation. We argue that the HOA is targeting you specifically because of your involvement in the recall effort, which violates your rights as a homeowner. We ask for an injunction preventing them from pursuing the lien until the matter is resolved. How much is this going to cost me? I'll be honest, probably $15,000 by the time we're done. But Xavier, if you don't fight this, you're setting a precedent that Patricia can do whatever she wants. And with the recall election coming up, showing that you're willing to stand up to her might influence other homeowners. I thought about it for a long moment, then nodded. Do it. File the lawsuit. Marcus prepared the complaint over the next week, and we filed it on March 28th in Summit County District Court. The lawsuit named the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association as the defendant and listed 3 main claims: selective enforcement of covenants, retaliation for protected activity, and unreasonable application of covenants causing undue hardship. The news spread through the community quickly. Several homeowners reached out to offer support, and a few even offered to contribute to my legal fund. Patricia remained silent, but the HOA retained a law firm from Denver to defend against the lawsuit. The special election was scheduled for May 6th. In the meantime, the community became increasingly polarized. There were those who supported Patricia, mostly older residents who appreciated strict enforcement and orderly neighborhoods. Then there were those who felt she had gone too far and wanted change. The divide was roughly 60-40 in favor of the recall, based on the informal polling Jennifer's group conducted. April brought warmer weather and the end of snow season. My truck sat idle most days now, which at least meant no new idling citations. But the lawsuit moved slowly through the court system. We had a preliminary hearing on April 15th, where the judge heard arguments about the injunction. Patricia's attorney argued that I was a serial violator who refused to follow community rules. Marcus countered with evidence of selective enforcement and the suspicious timing of the escalation. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Sarah Holbrook, listened carefully to both sides. At the end of the hearing, she granted a temporary injunction preventing the HOA from filing the lien until the full case could be heard. She also made a comment that stuck with me. "I've presided over far too many HOA disputes in my career," Judge Holbrook said. "They bring out the worst in people. Both sides here need to remember that you're neighbors who have to live together long after this case is resolved." The election on May 6th had the highest turnout for any HOA vote in the community's history. 187 of the 243 homeowners cast ballots. When the votes were counted that evening, the recall passed with 62% support. Patricia Drummond was removed from the HOA board effective immediately. Susan Kelly, who had been vice president, chose to resign rather than take over. This triggered another election to fill the vacant board positions, scheduled for June. In the interim, the 3 remaining board members included Richard, who had asked questions during my hearing, and 2 others who seemed more reasonable. With Patricia gone, I hoped things would calm down. I reached out to Richard and explained my situation in detail. He listened sympathetically and promised to bring the matter before the board. On May 20th, the HOA board held a special meeting to discuss the idling covenant. I attended along with Tom, who presented his mechanical testimony again. This time, the response was completely different. Richard and the other board members asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in finding a solution. After an hour of discussion, they voted unanimously to recommend a covenant amendment that would allow diesel vehicles to idle up to 20 minutes during cold weather months for maintenance purposes. The amendment would require approval from the homeowners, which meant another vote. But Richard assured me that they would support it and encourage others to do the same. In the meantime, they agreed to suspend enforcement of the idling citations against me pending the vote. I felt like I could finally breathe again. Marcus filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit with prejudice, meaning the HOA couldn't come after me for the same violations again. The HOA agreed to forgive the outstanding fines in exchange for the dismissal. Judge Holbrook approved the settlement on June 3rd. The covenant amendment vote took place in July. It passed with 78% approval. The new language specifically allowed diesel vehicles to idle up to 20 minutes when temperatures were below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with additional provisions for other mechanical necessities. It was a reasonable compromise that protected both my ability to maintain my equipment and the community's interest in controlling noise and emissions. By August, new board members had been elected. Jennifer Martinez became the new president, with Walter and 2 other level-headed residents filling out the board. Jennifer immediately set about reforming how the HOA operated, establishing clearer procedures for citations, creating an appeals process that actually meant something, and working to update outdated covenant language. I ran into Patricia once at the grocery store in September. She looked older somehow, more tired. She glanced at me, and for a moment I thought she might say something, but she just turned away and hurried down a different aisle. I felt a strange mix of vindication and pity. She had wielded power poorly and paid the price, but she was still a human being who had to live with the consequences of her actions. As fall arrived and temperatures began to drop again, I found myself preparing for another snow season. My truck sat in the driveway, reliable as ever, block heater plugged in and ready. The first real cold snap came in October, and one morning I went out at 4:30 to warm up the engine before heading out on a pre-season maintenance drive. The truck roared to life, and I let it idle. 15 minutes later, when the engine temperature had reached operating range and the oil pressure had stabilized, I put it in gear and headed out. No citations arrived in the mail. No angry neighbors glared from their porches. Just the normal routine of a working man taking care of his equipment. The whole ordeal had cost me time, money, and stress, but it had also taught me something important about standing up for what was right. Patricia had counted on people being too afraid or too tired to fight back. But when enough people said enough is enough, change became possible. Tom stopped by my house in late October to do a full service on the truck before winter really hit. As he worked, we talked about everything that had happened. He shook his head in amazement. I've been around a lot of diesel equipment and a lot of stubborn people, but I've never seen someone fight an HOA like you did. I didn't have much choice. It was my livelihood. No, you had a choice. You could have given up, paid the fines, and just accepted it, but you stood your ground. That takes guts. As November rolled around and the first significant snow of the season blanketed Breckenridge, I found myself grateful for how things had turned out. The new HOA board was reasonable and responsive. The covenant amendments protected not just me but anyone else who might face similar situations in the future. And my business was thriving, with even more contracts lined up for the winter season. Jennifer proved to be an excellent HOA president. She instituted regular town halls where residents could voice concerns before they escalated into formal disputes. She worked with a committee to review all the covenants and identify ones that were outdated or unreasonable. The community felt different now, more collaborative and less adversarial. In December, the HOA held its annual holiday party at the clubhouse. I almost didn't go, but Jennifer personally called and asked me to attend. When I walked in, several people came up to thank me for standing up to Patricia. They said it had inspired them to get more involved in the community and to speak up when something didn't seem right. Walter cornered me near the refreshment table, a cup of punch in his hand. "You know, Xavier, what you did changed this place. Before, everyone was afraid. Now people understand they have power if they stick together." "I was just trying to keep my truck running," he laughed. "Maybe so, but you became something bigger. You became a symbol." As I drove home that evening, I thought about everything that had happened since that morning in January when Patricia had stood on her porch with her clipboard. What started as a simple dispute over idling a truck had become a battle over principles, power, and community values. The lawsuit, the recall, the covenant amendments, all of it had been exhausting and expensive and frustrating. But it had also been necessary. Because when people with a little bit of authority start abusing it, someone has to be willing to say no. Someone has to be willing to fight, even when the odds seem stacked against them. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. It was a property management company from Frisco asking about snow removal services for the upcoming season. I quoted them a rate, and they accepted immediately. Another contract added to an already full schedule. Business was good. I parked the truck and plugged in the block heater, a routine so familiar now that I barely thought about it. Tomorrow morning I would start it up, let it idle for 15 minutes and head out to Plow. No fines, no harassment, no drama. Just honest work done right. As I walked into my house and hung up my coat, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine peace. The battle was over and I had won. Not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against arbitrary authority. The community was better for it, and that mattered more than anything else. The winter passed uneventfully. I plowed through storms, maintained my equipment properly, and watched my business grow. The HOA functioned smoothly under Jennifer's leadership. People still had disputes occasionally, but they were handled reasonably and fairly. The culture had shifted from fear and compliance to cooperation and common sense. In March, as the snow began to melt and another winter season drew to a close, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Patricia. The envelope had no return address, just my name and address written in careful handwriting. I opened it with curiosity and apprehension. Inside was a single page, handwritten on plain stationery. The letter was brief. Patricia wrote that she had spent the past several months reflecting on her time as HOA president. She acknowledged that she had become overly rigid in her enforcement and had lost sight of the purpose of the rules she was meant to uphold. She didn't explicitly apologize, but she admitted that she had handled my situation poorly and that the outcome had been fair. She ended by saying she hoped I would continue to be successful in my business and that the community would continue to improve under its new leadership. I read the letter twice, then folded it and put it back in the envelope. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, and that counted for something. People rarely admitted when they were wrong, especially in writing. Patricia had made mistakes, but at least she was capable of recognizing them eventually. I never responded to the letter. Some things were better left alone. The chapter was closed, and there was no need to reopen it. As spring turned to summer, I used the off-season to expand my business. I hired 2 part-time employees to help with spring cleanup and landscaping services. Tom helped me purchase a second truck, a slightly smaller diesel rig that would be perfect for residential driveways. Business was booming, and I was able to save more money than I had in years. The legal fees and fines had been painful, but I had recovered from them. More importantly, I had protected my ability to operate my business properly. The covenant amendment meant I would never again face the choice between destroying my equipment and facing harassment from the HOA. In August, I attended an HOA board meeting at Jennifer's request. She wanted to present me with a formal apology on behalf of the association for the way my case had been handled. I stood in front of the community, and Jennifer read a prepared statement acknowledging that the previous board had acted unreasonably and thanking me for my patience and persistence in seeking a fair resolution. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. It showed that the new leadership was willing to acknowledge past mistakes and commit to doing better. Several people applauded when Jennifer finished speaking. I thanked the board and the community for their support and said I was proud to be part of a neighborhood that could learn and grow from difficult experiences. As I left the meeting that evening, I ran into Tom in the parking lot. He had attended to show support, even though he didn't live in the community. We stood by our trucks talking for a few minutes, watching the sun set over the mountains. "You know, "I've worked on a lot of trucks for a lot of people," Tom said, "but I've never had a client quite like you. Most people would have just given up or moved away. You stuck it out." "Couldn't let Patricia win," I said with a smile. "It wasn't about her, though, was it? It was about what was right." I thought about that. "Yeah, I guess it was." Tom climbed into his truck and drove off with a wave. I stood there a moment longer, looking at my house, my truck, my little piece of this community. It had been a hell of a fight, but it was my home now, truly and completely. No one could take that away. The following winter season started in November, right on schedule. The first big storm hit on Thanksgiving weekend, and I was ready. I went out to my truck at 4 in the morning, started it up, and let it idle while I drank my coffee and checked my route schedule. The engine warmed up perfectly, just like it was supposed to. As I drove through the quiet pre-dawn streets of Breckenridge, plowing fresh snow and watching the sky begin to lighten in the east, I felt grateful for everything that had happened. The struggle had been real, but it had led to positive change not just for me but for everyone in the community. The covenant amendments, the new board leadership, the shift in culture, all of it stemmed from that one morning when I refused to accept an unjust fine. Sometimes fighting back is exhausting and expensive and seems pointless, but sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes standing up for yourself creates ripples that spread far beyond your individual situation. Sometimes one person saying no can change everything. I plowed through that winter with confidence and satisfaction. My business continued to grow. The HOA functioned smoothly. The community thrived. And every morning when I started my truck and let it idle, warming up properly before putting it to work, I was reminded that doing things the right way, even when people tell you not to, is always worth it in the end. The legal system had worked, slowly but surely. The community had spoken through their votes. The reasonable people had prevailed over the unreasonable ones. And a simple dispute over idling a truck had become a lesson in standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. As the years passed, the story of the HOA fight became something of a legend in Riverside Meadows. New homeowners would hear about it during their orientation meetings, used as an example of why the current board operated the way it did. My name became associated with positive change and the importance of questioning authority when it overstepped its bounds. I never sought that kind of recognition. I was just a guy trying to do his job and protect his equipment. But if my experience helped other people stand up for themselves, then all the stress and money and time had been worth it. Communities need people who are willing to fight when necessary, who refuse to be bullied or intimidated, who insist on fairness even when it's difficult. The truck continued to serve me well season after season. Every winter morning I followed the same routine. Start the engine, let it warm up, head out to work. Simple, straightforward, mechanically sound, the way it was always meant to be. And somewhere out there, Patricia lived her life, no longer wielding power over her neighbors, perhaps wiser from her experience or perhaps not. It didn't matter anymore. The community had moved on, stronger and healthier for having confronted and resolved the problem. That's the thing about HOAs and neighborhood disputes. They can bring out the worst in people, or they can be opportunities for communities to come together and demand better. It all depends on whether anyone is willing to stand up and fight for what's right, even when the deck seems stacked against them. I was willing to fight, and in the end, that made all the difference.